Thank you for listening to Tales from Witchaven. This podcast is created by Dan Lee and Rodeo Whiter and produced by Rodiax. Hello, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Jackson Thorne, reporting to you from JT Auto Repairs for all your motoring needs. As always, I'm joined by co-host and published author Imelda Blackwood.
Thank you, Jackson. If you're a regular listener, welcome back. If this is the first time you've tuned in, congratulations, you've made it. On this public access radio show, we aim to uncover all of the mysteries of our sleepy little town and expose them for what they are: a dark conspiracy, a supernatural threat from the great beyond, or just a big misunderstanding.
First of all, I would like to say a quick thank you to all of our listeners. Our small channel seems to have been growing very quickly, and we wanted to thank you all for supporting this station.
Yes, thank you indeed. It means so very much to us. I have also noticed that many of you aren't so scared of me anymore when you see me at the cafe. Please do feel free to come and say hi.
Okay, so this week we were going to investigate the dogs that appear in the graveyard every night and howl at the full moon. However, something else came up.
Indeed. If you were listening a couple of weeks ago, you may recall our little outing to the library.
How could anyone forget? We now have a dragon flying around our airspace and stealing things from the town.
True. Well, while we were there, we told you all that we wanted to take out a couple of books, one being the curious Tales from the Fireside.
Yes. Now, this book has certain myths or legends attached to it. I wanted to read the book and either prove or disprove these myths or legends. Tales from the Fireside is penned by two unknown authors and was never published. However, a leather-bound copy will manifest for those who are ready to delve into its pages.
There's an interesting mythology surrounding the authors as well. It is said that they still reside in an unseen dimension as the puppet masters of their own theatre of life, which contains an entire universe.
After living in Witchaven for so long, you start to realise everything is possible. Although I didn't expect what happened this week.
When you pick up Tales from the Fireside for the very first time, the stories within the pages swap around and create the perfect running order for the new reader.
The first story I read was The Stalk.
I haven't got to that one yet, although after this week I don't think I have to. I'm halfway through the painting at the moment, and I'm not entirely sure I want to read the ending.
Well, The Stalk is a ghost story by genre. But unlike the ghosts of Witchaven, who tend not to bother anyone all that much, the Stalk was a very dangerous ghost indeed. When he was alive in the early 1700s, he was a highwayman. But what set him apart from the other crooks and thieves at the time was his rather sinister pastime. He came from a little village set in the middle of the forest, and what he liked to do was lurk there waiting for passers-by. Then he would follow them silently through the trees for as long as possible, getting closer and closer until... well, that would be giving away the ending, wouldn't it?
Quite. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. This week's story really began when Jackson hightailed it to my cottage in the middle of the night, terrified after reading that particular tale.
I wouldn't say terrified.
You looked like you'd seen a ghost.
Exactly.
I quickly let Jackson inside and put on the kettle. Luckily, I hadn't yet gone to sleep myself. I was engrossed in a bit of late-night writing by candlelight. Anyway, I brewed us a pot of tea, and as usual, I fetched a plate of chocolate digestives.
What is your obsession, woman?
Chocolate is good for calming the nerves, and biscuits are good for dunking. Anyway, I didn't hear you complaining.
Fine.
So we sat down, and Jackson told me what had terrified him.
Like I said, I wasn't terrified.
Well, I say you were. So we sat down and he told me all about it. Now, we all read scary stories every now and then, or watch scary films. But we don't all go running round our friends' houses in the middle of the night.
If you'd have seen what I'd have seen...
I was getting to that part, all in good time. Anyway, there was Jackson sat in my living room crying.
Right, I'm telling it from here. We sat in the living room and I told Imelda that I had read the first story in that book, The Stalk. I was captivated by the story. It was really good, and it was nice to read a straight-up ghost story for a change. But it wasn't the story that bothered me. It was what I saw after. I went into the kitchen and put some milk in a saucepan ready to make a hot chocolate to take to bed. While I was waiting for that to boil, I looked out of my window and across the street. Through the trees I saw a noose hanging.
That would frighten anyone, I think.
Well, at first I didn't really think much of it, although I did think it a tad dangerous, so I thought I'd go out and cut it down. I put on my coat, got my boots on and went outside. I made my way over to the noose. I could still see it swaying in the wind. It was funny, there was a strange smell in the air that night.
Like what?
Kind of like gunpowder, or that old smell churches and antique mahogany furniture has.
Yes.
Well, that. Kind of musty. Well, I got over to the noose. Then a strong wind kicked up and blew a swarm of leaves across my vision.
Cornflakes.
What?
Cornflakes. That's what I call them, the leaves that have fallen to the ground in autumn, dried up and turned brown. I call them cornflakes.
Okay, well, vision was obscured by cornflakes, and when they had whisked past, the noose was no longer there. I thought it must have been blown up into the trees. I had a good look, but nothing. Then I heard a horse.
I don't like this bit.
I heard the hooves running on the cobbled street. I heard the snorting sound it makes when it charges. I looked around trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but it sounded like it was charging all around me, and I couldn't see the horse anywhere. Then I swear I could feel something warm on the back of my neck. I froze. I was terrified. And then I heard the laughter, right next to my ear. Not happy, but cold, as if it knew that he'd got me right where he wanted me. That's when I ran to yours.
The way you describe it chills my bones. Now, we already know the legend surrounding that particular book, but up until Jackson's experience with the stork, we thought it to be poppycock. However, with the new evidence that had presented itself, we thought it best not to read any more tales just yet.
Imelda agreed to let me sleep on her sofa that night because I didn't want to walk home in the dark. But we didn't really get much sleep after all.
No. At around 3 a.m, once we had finally said our good nights and I had gone up to bed, we experienced another fright.
It was horrible. There I was laying on the sofa, trying to get to sleep, when I heard it.
And so did Bertie, if my memory serves me.
That's right. Imelda's dog, Bertie, suddenly stood up in his basket and froze, as if he was listening to something. That was enough to freak me out, so I sat up and watched him. Suddenly I felt very cold, and Bertie began to howl.
I was only just drifting off, but that woke me up like a shot. Bertie never howls unless something is very wrong.
I felt like I was being watched, like someone somewhere in the room was staring at me. I was looking around frantically, but I couldn't see anyone. Bertie, on the other hand, looked like he could. I could see him following something across the room with his eyes, howling at it the whole time. It was going towards the stairs.
Meanwhile, I had gotten out of bed and was about to come downstairs to see what the hullabaloo was about, when I heard Jackson calling to me.
I started shouting to Imelda, telling her that the ghost was coming up the stairs. Bertie was howling too, probably trying to say the same thing.
I wrenched the door open and stared into the dark chasm before me. Then I flicked the light on, illuminating the hallway.
That's when Bertie stopped howling. It was as if whatever it was in the house had suddenly disappeared.
We decided that sleep wasn't really an option that night, and put on a pot of coffee. The next morning we went back to Jackson's house to consult the book that had started this whole escapade.
Tales from the Fireside was still on my bedside table where I'd left it. Of course, I wasn't much in the mood to read it, but seeing as the ghosts were already on the loose, there didn't seem to be much more that could happen. But in hindsight, we were wrong.
All over the town, people were whispering about strange noises in the night and footsteps right behind them as they walked home in the darkness. Dread hung stagnant in the air, and everyone we passed seemed to be looking over their shoulders. Clearly, this ghost was not just interested in Jackson.
It seemed to be interested in anyone that it could claim as its next victim. For the next couple of nights, word spread, and everyone in the town was too scared to go out at night. which did mean the town's werewolves were happy, but something had to be done.
We spent a long time trawling through the pages of that book, trying to find something that would help us eradicate the evil spirit. But the book didn't help.
We have had our fair share of strange and weird experiences in this town, but we both thought this time we were out of our depth. We needed professional help. We considered calling Beatrice Featherstone. She was still pretty mad at us for wasting her time at the Purple Frog, but it had to be worth a try.
We telephoned her at the greengrocer's, where she works her day job, and requested that she come and help us. Surprisingly, she agreed without too much fuss. Apparently, she had heard some of the townsfolk complaining about their own supernatural happenings, and about 10 minutes before I called her, she had her own disturbing experience with the new ghost of Witchaven, and a couple of overripe melons.
I really want to know what happened.
So do I, but she wouldn't tell me. Anyway, it was clear what needed to be done. We had to hold a séance and send the ghost back to the pages from whence it came.
Who are you going to call?
Not now, Jackson.
Oh. Last time we used Mrs. Featherstone's services, we were trying to contact what we thought was a ghost and find out what it wanted. But this case was different. We knew that it was there. We knew who it was, and we knew what it wanted. So when Mrs. Featherstone came to my house that night, the ritual we performed was quite different from last time.
We gathered in Jackson's bedroom, where he had first awakened the spirit.
It was a bit weird, really. We all had to sit in a circle around my bed.
The book was placed in the middle, and the three of us clustered around it in preparation for the ritual. A spark of excitement danced between us as the anticipation electrified the air. Of course, for Miss Featherstone, this was common practice, but Jackson and I are still stirred by a good séance.
Beatrice opened the book to the first page, but of course the book rearranges to suit the reader, so for her the stork wasn't the first tale in the book. Instead it was the children in the wars, or something like that. So we closed the book again, and I opened it. Then the stork was on the first page.
She started to scan the pages quickly, her eyes darting across the words, the way fingers flit across the piano keys. She was also studying the illustrations at the start of the story. Then she began to mumble to herself, her words just out of reach. Neither of us could quite work out what she was saying.
We ended up looking at each other, wondering what we were supposed to do. All we could hear was the mumbling from Mrs. Featherstone. I mouthed to Imelda, "What do we do?"
And I shrugged my shoulders. Not that we're questioning your practices, Miss Featherstone, but a little instruction might be nice, especially for those of us who aren't seasoned professionals in the art of communing with the dead.
That's when her head shot up from the pages of the book and stared through the bedroom doorway into the darkness.
That was really quite frightening.
I think we were both expecting something to jump out at us from that silent gloom.
Ha! But it was that silly woman who broke the silence, wasn't it? She let the silence grow until gooseflesh had prickled up across our skin and our hearts were hammering in our ears. Then, all of a sudden, she said, "We need a Ouija board," which in itself is a non-threatening sentence, but it scared the hell out of both of us.
She took the board out of her bag and placed it on the bed. She then took out a glass and put it in the middle of the board.
Then she seemed to be gripped in the throes of a trance. A string of mumbled dialogue escaped her lips as she swayed drunkenly from side to side. Neither Jackson or I could understand a word she was saying. We looked at each other, completely at a loss. All the while her swaying and lamenting grew ever more violent. Then she stopped and fell silent. "Is there anyone there?" she asked. No response at first. The gloom seemed to tighten around us as all of us held our breaths, suspended in anticipation. "If there is anyone here, make yourself known." Still nothing.
I thought she was going to storm out again, but she didn't this time. She kept asking the room if there was anyone there.
It almost seemed like she knew there was someone there, but they weren't in any mood to chat. She asked once more. That's when they responded.
The glass, untouched by human hand, moved to the no on the board.
This ghost was clearly trying her patience, but this action of jest certainly did relieve the fear.
Not for long, though. We found it quite funny, but Mrs. Featherstone looked daggers at us and said it wasn't a laughing matter. She told us that a ghost does not move the glass by force, but the board and the glass are connected to the inner conscience of the ghost. I didn't quite understand what she was saying at the time, but from what I understand, a Ouija board basically acts as a type of truth serum for ghosts.
I like to think of it as a polygraph for the great beyond. The spirit answers, but it is forced to answer correctly, or something. However, she did say that if a ghost could defy the board, then it must be a very powerful ghost indeed, and capable of serious wrongdoing.
Then the glass started to move again.
It moved to the H, and then to the A, then back to the H, and back to the A. Backwards and forwards it went between those letters, faster and faster until the frantic swapping was halted by the glass shooting past our heads and into the darkness of the hallway. We heard it shatter against the wall. Neither Jackson nor I knew what to do.
I don't think Mrs. Featherstone did either.
Quite. We sat in silence for a moment, waiting for a cue that Beatrice never gave. Then the air began to chill. Our skin shot up in gooseflesh, this time brought on by the cold, and each of us could feel the sickly warmth of someone breathing down our necks.
That's when we heard laughter right in our ears.
Within seconds the room was swarming with objects, flying around, as if tossed to and fro in the grip of some wild invisible octopus. Maniac laughter swirled around us, and somewhere in the midst of this commotion I saw a noose hanging in the corner of my vision. Then the horses started galloping.
We could barely see what was going on, although I was convinced this was definitely a ghost and not a very nice one. The commotion, however, seemed to focus on Mrs. Featherstone. It seemed to leave Imelda and me alone. We tried to get close to her so we could pull her away, but something kept pushing us back.
Then I saw that noose again, but this time it was not hanging in my peripheral vision. This time it manifested from the darkness of the hallway and swooped straight for Miss Featherstone. The loop went straight over her head and immediately began tightening.
We were still trying to get within 3 foot of her, but we couldn't. We were still being pushed back.
We could see the noose ruthlessly tightening, squeezing the life out of Miss Featherstone inch by terrible inch. Miss Featherstone was trying to struggle against it, but to no avail. All of the strength she could muster was no match for the apparition's ghostly force. But finally she managed to choke out a single word. Neither Jackson nor I could make out what it was, but all of a sudden everything stopped. All of the possessed objects fell lifelessly to the floor, as did Jackson and I, and Miss Featherstone, ragged breath heaving from her chest, collapsed in a heap on the bed.
She told us that the ghost was way too powerful for her. She was a medium, not an exorcist. She told us to speak to Father Sebastian.
On a side note, Miss Featherstone, if you're going to do this sort of stuff, maybe tell someone else that magic word as well. You know, just in case.
Anyway, Beatrice Featherstone packed up her things and left my house in quite a hurry, and who can blame her? But before she left, she phoned this Father Sebastian character, and he agreed to pay us a visit.
Bearing in mind we hadn't gotten much sleep for the past 3 or 4 days since Jackson had summoned the spirit, we were rather hoping that Father Sebastian was available sooner rather than later. Luckily for us, he was available the very next day.
That's right, we were expecting him to turn up at night, the way exorcists normally do in scary films, but he arrived around midday. According to him, it's actually best to exorcise dark spirits in the daytime, when they're at their weakest.
It makes perfect sense when you put it like that.
It's a bit spooky, really. I thought it at the time, but I didn't say anything.
What?
One of the main characters in the story was called Sebastian. It's a weird coincidence.
Maybe it's not a coincidence at all.
Maybe not. When he arrived, he started with the book, much the same as Mrs. Featherstone had. He closed his eyes and held it, muttering under his breath and rubbing the book's cover. It looked like he was enjoying it a bit too much.
Then he put the book down on the bedside table, without opening it once. He spread his arms wide, and he spoke directly to the spirit.
"Go, unholy apparition, back to the demon realm from whence you came."
That was quite good.
Thanks. Well, the room started shaking again. objects started to fly around the room, and we could hear that laughter again.
That horrible laughter. We then saw the noose again, flying in the hurricane surrounding us. It whipped itself around the neck of Father Sebastian, although he seemed to be unfazed by it. He just held his concentration.
You could tell at that point the ghost was getting very agitated.
You could feel the tension in the room.
Well, after a few minutes of the priest talking and objects being thrown every which way and lights flickering, the ghost appeared suspended in the middle of the circle.
Those angry red eyes are something I'll never forget. Blood blossomed from them, as if the spirit had died in extreme pain. They weren't red by nature, they were red by torture.
And at that moment the noose vanished. The objects fell to the floor, and Father Sebastian stared at the ghost, an angry vein pulsating in his forehead.
The ghost could do no more than hang listlessly in the air. It seemed that it had been entrapped by Father Sebastian's words.
The priest stood up and met the ghost face to face. He said some more nonsense words and made the sign of the cross on the ghost.
I think it was Latin rather than nonsense, but in this day and age they're more or less the same language. In any case, no sooner had the preacher uttered his final words, the ghost was dispersed in 1,000 rays of brilliant light.
Speaking to Father Sebastian afterwards, he told us that the spirit was not in fact a spirit, but a projection from the book.
Meaning, dear listeners, that the spirit that haunted Witchaven was like a carbon copy of the real ghost, summoned from the cursed book to act as a pawn to collect souls on his part, which means that the real ghost is still at large.
He also said that the projection will be feeding back to the real ghost, so the real Stork will now be aware of our strange little town, and one day may well choose to pay another visit.
For now, though, the spectre is hidden back within those pages, and we are safe. But, dear listeners, I must urge you to take caution. There's a power within words that few can understand. One must be wary reading certain books, for you never know when one might possess a power greater than that of traditional literature.
That just about brings us up to the end of this week's show. We just have time for a couple of community announcements before we go. Following a nasty incident, Mrs. Weeder will not be tending the roses for the next few weeks. Mrs. Weeder, we hope your hand grows back soon. Arthur McGregor would like to invite everyone to the town's book swap next week. I will certainly be attending, and will welcome anyone who wants to swap for Tales by the Fireside.
Jackson, that's a library book.
What? I don't want it. Patrick Pattersby would like to remind you all that the Witchaven Marching Band will be practising on Tuesdays in the town hall, so if you could all keep the noise to a minimum between 10 a.m. and lunchtime, that would be much appreciated. And finally, Mrs. Clitheroe will be baking her first batch of yomping bread this week, so she advises that you come and get it before it gets you. We are now approaching the witching hour, so we wish you a good night, and remember, listeners, reading can be a dangerous pastime. Thank you for listening to Tales from Witchaven. This podcast was brought to you from the minds of Dan Lee and Rodeo Whiter, produced by Rodiacs. If you have enjoyed your stay, please like, subscribe and follow us as we explore more mysteries from this sleepy little town. Beware, the witching hour draws near.